In a quiet North Carolina town, a secret was growing, one that would shock the nation. Stephen Plattle, a man with a dark past, and his daughter, Katie Fusco, a young woman searching for her identity, found themselves bound by more than just familial love. What began as a family reunion twisted into a forbidden relationship, leading to tragedy no one could have imagined. Love, obsession, betrayal, and murder. This is not just a story of a crime, but a nightmare hidden behind closed doors. Stephen Plattle was born and raised in Levittown, New York. He was defined as a strange guy who seldom socialized at school. He was quiet and would often get bullied by the other students. Well, fast forward to 1995, when Stephen was 20. He was in an online chat room when he came across a girl named Alyssa from San Antonio, Texas. But there was one major problem. Alyssa was only 15 at the time that she met Stephen, but the two struck up a conversation and things moved pretty fast from that point on. Basically, to put a long story short, Stephen traveled all the way from New York to Texas, stood at Alyssa's doorstep, and demanded they make their relationship official. It was clear that 20-year-old Stephen was grooming 15-year-old Alyssa. Even Alyssa's parents were taken aback by the whole situation, but for some reason, they didn't stop Alyssa from going to New York with Stephen. And before anyone knew it, 16-year-old Alyssa fell pregnant. Now, this was already a bit messed up because Alyssa was still a minor. And now, 9 months from now, she was going to be a mom. This was all taking place so quickly, and it was seriously making everyone's head spin. This came completely out of nowhere. Well, things would only go downhill from here. Alyssa soon got more than just a glimpse of the person Stephen was. He was volatile, and he would flip the switch from calm to calamitous in half a second. And to make things worse, it was also proven that he abused animals. This man was just something else. Well, soon enough, it finally clicked for Alyssa that she was isolated in a vast city with no contact with family or friends. She was also stuck with a man from whom there was no escape. Even after the birth of their daughter, Denise, Stephen wouldn't let go of his abusive antics. He would fly off the handle anytime Denise would cry, and even tried to lock her in an ice chest one time, in hopes that it would, quote, shut her up. Fortunately, Alyssa would find Denise, and she was mostly unharmed, partly because she was a baby and her young mind couldn't register her own father was trying to suffocate her. But Stephen wouldn't even hold his daughter and refused to change or feed her, which is just insane. Denise was his own flesh and blood, his own daughter, but he was so indifferent to her. Meanwhile, Alyssa was being subjected to abuse just the same, if not more intense. But devastatingly, Alyssa wouldn't leave Stephen, even though the pair weren't even married. Now, I don't know if it was because of genuine fear or because she was brainwashed by Stephen from a very young age, but Alyssa couldn't muster up the courage to pick up her daughter and leave this menacing man. But she knew one thing for sure. Denise couldn't live like this. She didn't want Denise to become another toy for Stephen to play with and break. So when baby Denise was just 8 months old, Alyssa put her up for adoption. Denise was ultimately adopted by an amazing family, the Fuscos. Alyssa and Stephen got married in 2006, and don't ask me why or how because I'm genuinely as confused as you are. But personally, I think Alyssa was probably just too scared to leave Stephen, because like a textbook emotionally abusive person, Stephen threatened to end his own life if Alyssa ever left him. And Alyssa, she didn't want that on her hands. As much as she was afraid of him, Alyssa loved Stephen, and she couldn't bear the thought of something bad happening to him, even if it was self-inflicted. And Stephen knew this, meaning that Alyssa played right into his little game. He was a master manipulator. If that wasn't enough, Alyssa gave birth to 2 more girls with Stephen, but Stephen was still volatile and abusive with Alyssa, and downright neglectful when it came to caring for his daughters. But if we're being real, this was pretty much to be expected. But anyway, the family of 4 soon moved to Enrico, Virginia, and Alyssa had to work a day in and day out job to make ends meet because, surprise, surprise, Stephen couldn't hold down a job for the life of him. Now, Alyssa tried to take her kids and leave Stephen multiple times by this point, but he pulled out the same old tricks on her and threatened to make her life miserable even after he was gone. This guy was just not letting up. But if you thought this man was already bad news, well, things are about to get much, much worse. And this case is about to fall into a very dark place, the likes of which you could never imagine. As Alyssa was trapped living with Steven, Denise, on the other hand, was getting all the love and care from her adoptive parents. Anthony and Katie Fusco opened their arms and house in Dover, New York, for Denise and legally changed her name to Katie. This was a fresh start for little Katie. The name change was symbolic, and it signaled a new start to her life as Katie Fusco. Katie was brought up in a very normal household. Her love for animals ran deeper than the surface, so much so that she was trying to be a vegetarian as much as she could. She also loved art and writing, and she was a cheerleader at Dover High School. And she had plans to attend Dutchess Community College to take up art and work in online advertising. Katie had so many plans, and it's so heartwarming to see how far she'd come from being initially raised, if you could call it that, by Steven. From being in this unstable household and unsafe environment where her own father was after her life and wasn't above harming her, to now being in a loving and stable home with adoring parents and a normal life. Anthony, her new father, was a retired corrections officer at the Federal Correctional Institute in Danbury, Connecticut. And Kelly, her new mom, was a secretary. They had a daughter of their own, but decided to adopt Katie rather than having another biological child. The Fuscos were a very normal and happy family. They were exactly the kind of parents that Katie needed. Katie had a lot of dreams and ambitions, and her knack for creativity was undeniably strong. She was only 16, and her words held more emotion, power, and moving feelings than any top literature out there. She was truly a gifted young girl. She graduated from high school in 2016 and was looking forward to attending college. But there was one thing that Katie yearned for more than anything, and it was to find out who her birth parents were, and if there was a chance to possibly meet them. Katie was 18 at the time when she was struck with this urge to track down her birth parents. Now, Katie was living in a happy household with everything she could have ever wanted. Her adoptive parents were great, and her relationship with her sister was also amazing. But there was always this gnawing feeling, that feeling that many adopted children get, where they just want to know where they came from, biologically. It's a pretty natural curiosity to develop. We all want to know where we come from and what makes us, us, at least to some extent. Well, Katie had this same level of curiosity. But the problem is, Katie had no idea that some curiosities are better left alone. But she would learn this the hard way, because she had set in her mind she wanted to track down her biological father, hoping to rekindle a lost relationship and somehow make amends with her dad. Katie was desperately hoping to find her long-lost and loving father, but instead, she found Steven Plattle. In August of 2016, Katie managed to track down her mom, Alyssa, on Facebook, and she sent her a message. I'm sure her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly, had told Katie about her biological parents. I mean, she knew she was adopted, obviously, and she had a little bit of knowledge about them, but the info she had was, at this point, nearly 2 decades old. So really, Katie had no idea what to expect from her birth parents. Meanwhile, Alyssa, who was still with Steven after all this time, was still working multiple jobs to keep a roof over the family's head and food on the table. When Alyssa saw the message, it was a pleasant surprise in her exhausting world. She and Katie messaged back and forth, and they soon made plans to meet up. Katie and Alyssa met each other in Nightingale, North Carolina. The two talked for hours, and Alyssa was honestly just so happy to see Katie, or Denise in her eyes, living a good life. Katie was a part of Alyssa. She was her own daughter. If there was anyone who loved and tried to protect Katie when she was a baby, it was Alyssa. She'd spent the last 18 years circling Katie's birth date on a calendar and just wishing the best for her. On the other hand, Katie was also thrilled to meet her biological mom. And imagine her joy when she found out that her parents were still together and that she even had 2 younger sisters. It was as if Katie's family just expanded overnight, and she couldn't have been happier. But Katie was never told about her father's abuse, or the fact that his actions are what led her to being placed up for adoption in the first place. Now, why Alyssa didn't bring this up, we don't really know. I guess it's not the kind of thing you mention when you first meet your long-lost daughter, but at the same time, you'd kind of assume that was one of Katie's first questions. Why'd you put me up for adoption? So how Katie didn't find out about her father's abuse, God only knows. But I think they were just trying to get to know each other, and they kept the conversations mostly about themselves and what they were up to over the past 18 years, keeping things light. It wasn't like Alyssa urged Katie to move back in with her and her family or something. She was genuinely happy for her daughter and the way she was living out her dreams. But surprisingly, soon enough, Katie even met up with Steven, and the meeting went fine, even better than anyone expected. But in the end, Katie made a decision, and it was seriously just a bolt out of the blue for everyone. Katie decided to move back in with her biological parents, Alyssa and Steven. This must have been a punch in the gut for Katie's adoptive parents, and it was certainly unexpected across the board. But Steven and Alyssa agreed to take her in, but no one had even the slightest inkling that Steven had much darker plans. After meeting her biological parents, Katie suddenly had a change of plans, and this involved her entire life. Before, she was going to go to college and was thinking about working in online advertising. Now, she wanted to drop everything and move back in with her biological parents. Katie's adoptive parents were honestly shocked to hear this. They didn't want Katie to put all of her plans on hold and go back to Enrico. But here's the thing, Katie was 18. She could make decisions for herself, and even though her parents tried to reason with her, if Katie wanted to do something, she could, no questions asked. Her adoptive parents were honestly left in a very confusing situation. They didn't want to stop Katie from getting to know her biological parents, but she was rearranging everything in her life solely for this reason, and that was what worried them the most. But again, they couldn't do much. Back in the Plattle household, Steven was overjoyed at the news of Katie coming to live with them. But there was one big kicker. Steven and Alyssa were not on great terms. They were still living in the same house, but in separate bedrooms. They were still married, but largely living completely separate lives. They were on the verge of a separation, and eventually a divorce, but things just hadn't been made official yet. Regardless, Steven was still excited about his daughter moving in. But this is also when some red flags started to show. It seems that Alyssa quickly noticed Steven losing all interest in her. Yes, they'd had their issues and were obviously looking to separate, but once Katie moved in, it was like Steven's focus had completely shifted. He just felt different. He started giving every second of his attention to Katie, basically tossing everything and everyone else by the wayside. Soon enough, he even started to change his style and started dressing as though he were much younger, even though he was in his mid-40s. He grew his hair out, he took care of his appearance and the clothes that he wore and started dressing more like a teenager, if anything. But then he made the strangest move of all. He moved out of his own bedroom and started sleeping on the floor in Katie's room. Even Alyssa's eyes bugged out when she saw this happen, because if you remember, she still lived in the same house. She even confronted Steven about it, but he just gave her the runaround, then left the home alongside Katie. But the thing is, Steven and Alyssa's other daughters still lived in this house as well, so for the whole family to witness this incredibly bizarre situation unfold, it was just so far beyond comprehension that everyone basically just stood there with their jaws on the floor. No one knew what to make of this. It was completely and wholeheartedly just, I don't even know. But if you can possibly, in some way imagine, things were still, somehow, about to get worse. By the end of it all, Alyssa moved out of the Plattle home in November of 2016, and she and Steven shared custody of their two daughters. Alyssa moving out just made things even worse, and I'm warning you now, this is about to get wild in the worst way. See, Alyssa would take the two daughters with her from time to time, and one day in May of 2017, she came across an entry in her daughter's diary that literally made her sick to her stomach. The diary revealed that Steven and Katie were dating. And yes, you heard that right. A father was in a relationship with his own daughter. And not only this, but Katie was now pregnant with Steven's child. Let that sink in. Alyssa was floored, and she immediately called Steven to confront him about this revolting news. And you might be wondering what Stephen's response was. Well, all he said was, "I thought you knew. We're in love." And he said it so nonchalantly, as if there was nothing wrong with being in love with his own daughter. If this man is good at anything, it's making people sick to their stomach. Now, Alyssa did call the police on Stephen for obvious reasons, but no arrests were made. In the meantime, Katie and Stephen moved in with Stephen's mom in Knightdale, North Carolina, and the two had plans to marry each other. Now, how Stephen's mom let this happen, look, I don't even know anymore. The sheer number of mistakes and misjudgments surrounding this case, I genuinely cannot even fathom how all of this unfolded. But just when you think this case can't get any worse, yet again it proves you wrong. Alyssa thought that she had done her part by calling the police on Stephen, and she thought that they would handle everything. But she was in for another surprise. On July 20th of 2017, Stephen, age 43, and Katie, now 20, got married in Parkton, Maryland, alongside Stephen's mom and Katie's adoptive parents. Katie even posted her wedding pictures on social media, and you can clearly tell that she's pregnant in all the photos. But what's so unsettling, aside from a father marrying his own daughter, was the fact that both of the parents of the bride and groom were smiling, as if this was a completely normal wedding. Now, I certainly hope that they were just putting on a front as to not cause a stir, but at the same time, cause a stir. This is messed up from every possible conceivable angle. This marriage should have been illegal, and it was. But Stephen, on top of being a nasty person, was unfortunately smart too. So he lied on the paperwork that he and Katie weren't related by blood, which made the marriage legal. Sort of. It's not really legally binding if you lie, but still the paperwork managed to get pushed through, and these two were now legally, sort of, a married couple. What I cannot understand is how can Katie's adoptive parents just stand there with a smile on their faces, almost as if they're supporting this? And how could Katie, a 20-year-old grown woman, allow this to happen? She wasn't being threatened, she wasn't in fear like Alyssa was. Katie chose this because it's what she wanted. But get this, before moving out, Alyssa told Katie everything about Stephen abusing her as a baby, trying to claim her life, and taking no part in caring for her as his own daughter. Alyssa spilled everything, but Katie seemed unfazed by all of it. It was as if she were talking to a robot. Katie had no emotion on her face, and she probably assumed Alyssa was lying. Alyssa was certain that Stephen had a hand in successfully brainwashing and turning Katie against her own mom, which is just devastating. It really sounds like a twisted fictional story, but this is real life, and it's about to get even more sick. Less than 2 months after the twisted wedding on September 1st, 2017, Katie gave birth to a baby boy, who she named Bennett Plattle. Soon after, finally in January of 2018, Stephen and Katie were both arrested for all the obvious reasons, and in court, Stephen's attorney argued that the relationship was consensual, and Stephen was, quote, head over heels in love with his own daughter, a 20-year-old woman. And his attorney claimed that their love, quote, outweighed the issue of them being biologically related. I beg your finest pardon? This is so much bigger than mere consent. This is his own daughter, and he has the audacity to argue in court that love clouded his judgment? Well, this debacle ended with both Stephen and Katie getting released on bond, with custody of Bennett going to Stephen's mom, of all people, and prohibition of contact between Katie and Stephen. Katie went on to live back with her adoptive parents, and that was when reality finally hit her like a ton of bricks. Katie, after all was said and done, finally came to her senses and finally called Stephen and told him that she wanted a divorce as soon as possible. But Stephen did not take this news well. He didn't want to let Katie go, just how he didn't want to let Alyssa go. Katie was finally away from Stephen's grasp, and this made him see red. He likely felt that Katie had been successfully brainwashed by her adoptive parents, but we all know the reality is quite the opposite. Sometime before the fateful day of April 11th, 2018, Stephen had concocted a plan. If he couldn't have Katie and live in his sick and deranged happily ever after, then he was going to ruin everything and everyone who shattered his idea of a perfect life. Stephen was now out for blood. He wanted anyone and everyone involved with stealing his newfound love away from him to be completely removed from the picture, and this included his newborn son, Bennett. But Stephen wasn't done there. His main target was still his wife, Katie, and he finally figured out where she was and what she was up to on April 12th. This was the day his plan would finally be set into motion. See, Katie and her adoptive dad, Anthony, went from their home in Dover to Waterbury, Connecticut, to visit Katie's adoptive grandma to help her with clearing her house. This was a detail that Stephen knew all too well. Stephen made the trip from North Carolina to Dover and basically waited near Katie's home to see them leave for Connecticut. This scene was actually caught on CCTV. You can see Katie and Anthony driving down a somewhat busy road, and right behind them is a Honda minivan driven by Stephen. What was even more terrifying was that he was armed. He had a loaded firearm in his passenger seat, and he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and within minutes he hit his mark. Anthony slowed his car down at a stop sign at the intersection of Route 7 and Route 55 as they were en route to New Milford, Connecticut. Stephen pulled up alongside them at the stop sign, and he fired round after round into Anthony's car, at his daughter Katie, and at her dad, Anthony. Witnesses reported that it was peaceful one minute, and the next, the piercing banging sounds were heard at the intersection. And after the noises stopped, the minivan sped off into the distance. The police and emergency services were called to the scene, and once officers and paramedics arrived at the car, they were speechless. The bodies of Katie and Anthony were found slumped in their seats, and the floor of the vehicle was littered with bullets. It just shows that Stephen's attack was frenzied and completely unforgiving. He wanted to make sure he didn't miss his target, and unfortunately he was successful. But at the time, the police didn't know that this was the doing of Stephen Plato, so they were left with a lot of questions. No one knew who attacked two people so ruthlessly. Well, that was when another 911 call was received, and this call was made by none other than Stephen's mom. And on the call, she was hysterical. See, she'd gotten a call from Stephen, and during that call, he confessed to everything, how he took the lives of everyone. Stephen's mom called the police right away, and a team was sent to her home. But no sooner than they arrived, they realized Stephen wasn't there and appeared to be on the run. Well, 18 miles away from where Anthony and Katie were found in their vehicle, a silver minivan was discovered in Dover. When the police arrived, they saw a man in the driver's seat with a self-inflicted wound. In his hand was the same firearm used on Anthony and Katie. Stephen had successfully and unfortunately managed to evade the law by taking the coward's way out. Whether Stephen knew that it was only a matter of time before he was caught, or if this was his plan all along, he took his actions with him to his grave and robbed the victims' loved ones of closure and the chance of getting any level of justice. Katie, Anthony, and baby Bennett were buried on April 21st, 2018 in St. Charles Cemetery, Dover Plains, New York. Alyssa is now left with wounds and regrets that she can never heal from. She lost her daughter at the hands of her own husband, a man who was clearly either sick, deranged, or both. In the end, 3 lives were taken, and no one was reprimanded because the very oppressor took matters into his own hands. Cases like this don't have an upside. They don't offer closure. They don't really teach us anything other than monsters, murderers, killers, whatever you want to call them. They're often hiding in plain sight. Sometimes they're our neighbors. Sometimes they're our parents, or maybe even our spouses. And sometimes they're both. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Tim Brown and Melissa Baldwin. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I appreciate all of you guys that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find a link down in the description. And don't forget, the new True Crime Stories It's Never a Mannequin t-shirt is also now available at the link below. Every purchase helps support the channel, and you get a really cool shirt in return. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered, and don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.